Lakeland PBS presents Common Ground, brought to you by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and the citizens of Minnesota. Production funding of Common Ground is made possible in part by First National Bank Bemidji, continuing their second century of service to the community. Member FDIC. Welcome to Common Ground. I'm producer-director Scott Knudsen. In this episode, native artist Duane Goodwin creates a sculpture for the University of Minnesota Morris that examines some of the injustices of the boarding school era.
My Indian name is Niwugabo. I'm a white earth enrollee. My English name is Duane Goodwin. Summer of 2018, I sculpted a monumental scale, 3-figure sculpture representing the boarding school era.
It's been an amazing project for me personally to work on, and I'm thankful to everyone involved, and I see some of the faces of people who've been involved in this project from the beginning, and I thank you very much for being here today and for all the work that you've done.
I guess, this sculpture was kind of like a really lifetime achievement. It's something that I've been working for all my life to do, another piece of work, and that connection to the boarding school is something I'm very familiar with. My grandmother went to school there, so I was very connected to the theme of the boarding school.
Before the University of Minnesota Morris was established here, the campus housed an American Indian boarding school.
Morris foremost was a boarding school when it started out. It was started out in the latter 1800s and ended in the early 1900s. A fairly short-lived boarding school. But their concentration was on agriculture, growing their own food, which they did.
The sculpture is a visible reminder of the role that Native peoples have played in this place. Their histories have not always been happy ones, but those histories are inextricably linked to that of our campus.
So I was gone, almost the course of 3 months last summer. Bambi supported me from the start, with supporting the home, because we have a lot of responsibility at the home front here. Especially, we have animals and so forth.
My name is Bambi Goodwin, and I am married to Duane Goodwin. It will be 48 years next month. That's a long time. Duane had a deadline, and it was a lot of work. He didn't come home, I don't think, maybe once during that period.
Well, time to get geared up, because by 3 o'clock we may be done if it gets too hot.
He had 2 helpers, and they were young men that, could lift those heavy saws, and he still did a lot of lifting and cutting.
Joe, you want to grab that step stool there?
But I was so glad he had help, because this rock carving is tough on him.
Joe was from Red Lake, and he was an intern that the travel college paid for. And then Inkpa was an apprentice that I trained in a number of years ago. So he was a big help. He could dig right into it, and he could see what I seen. We had a great model to follow that was 3-dimensional scale, and we had a great site to do the work on. The rock started out at 9 tons, 8 feet by 5.5 feet by 30 inches. It was installed June 29th of 2018. They had a 100,000-pound crane lifting the rock off the flatbed over the trees and placed it on the foundation. And the rock came from Winona, Minnesota. That's another great aspect about the project. The rock is from Minnesota. Well, this specific type of rock has a lot of geological history to it. First of all, I found out from a geologist that studied this rock that this rock originally part of an aquifer. Because of that, I titled this sculpture Nokomis Nebi, which means grandmother water. It's very brittle and it's very hard. So much of the rock was sawed and then broke away with a hammer drill and chisels. You score the rock and then you take the hammer drill and you break it at the base of the score till all the rough rock is removed. And then from there you reduce your tools to smaller cutters.
Let's saw this down at the base so it's even. Yeah, it usually helps out quite a bit.
Igpa, he was the apprentice. And then you had Joe Strong, who was an intern from Red Lake. And both these young guys were young and strong. And they both had an influential part of the process. You know, the experience was working creatively, being on task, taught them to be responsible. Because both of them were responsible throughout the course of this project. Hey, Paul, we're doing. I think we all had a vision, you know, we all seen the vision. And we all worked cohesively together to make it happen. I didn't have to instruct them exactly what to do anymore. They just knew exactly what to do. This is how much rock we got to take off today. The only thing I had to watch, because we had some big tools we were working with, and you couldn't go beyond some of the depth that we had to cut into that rock, so you had to really watch yourself. They had a good sense of what we were doing.
We might have to stop and have another lunch break, because we had an early lunch.
Because they could feel the significance of the project, and they could see the model, and they could see how that was being transformed into this big, big piece, this little bitty scale model we were following very closely. So, you know, every time you were working on a general area, you had to follow that area, because there was certainly a lot to do removing that negative rock without making too many critical mistakes.
How deep on that one? A plunge?
This is the deepest. And this one will be the shallowest.
So we were fairly successful in removing that rock and getting it to look as much as possible like the model.
And this maybe only about
Inch and a half?
half an
Half inch, okay, I can do it. People didn't have no idea what the boarding school was. A lot of people have no idea that this ever took place and what effects they had on the Native American people. Elaine Fleming is the former mayor of Cass Lake and a Leech Lake Tribal College teacher. Elaine is a very knowledgeable historian on the Leech Lake, Band of Ojibwe, and the Native American boarding school.
Bejiko benesia que indigo mang indu dame, ga usasquadjime cagandun jaba gamasquawako cogninda, Elaine Fleming Nindishina Kaz. So the name that the universe knows me by is One Thunderbird Woman. I'm with the Loon clan. I'm a member of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe of the Minnesota Chippewa tribe. And I live in Gamasquawakokog, the place where there used to be red cedar trees. It's called Cass Lake. I work for Leech Lake Tribal College, and I've been working here for a quarter of a century. Yeah. The boarding school era, that occurred during the assimilation era. And that was about 1870 to 1934, the assimilation era. And that's when they were trying to take away our tribal identities. They were trying to assimilate us into being US citizens. And they were also trying to take our land away from us. And so there were crazy things that happened during the assimilation era. And one of them was the 1887 Allotment Act. And that was one of the ways that they took the remaining land that we had. During that era, in order to turn us into citizens, US citizens, they developed the boarding schools. and it became mandatory to send our children to the boarding schools. And so it was just a horrific time for us because we loved our children. That's the way things are. We love our children. And some of those children were as young as 4 years old when they would be taken away into the boarding schools. And they would be separated.
Carl Goblin is a former instructor from the University of St. Scholastica and is a historian on the boarding school era.
My name is Carl Goblin. I'm a Boys Fort enrollee. My father and his family were originally from Rainy Lake. We were one of the people that immigrated to the reservation in about 1918 or so. I went to public school. I was an artist and an art major, and I began to get interested in boarding schools when I did research at the Walker Art Center when I was a museum intern there. And Duane, when he was a teenager, attended the Institute of Indian Arts in Santa Fe. One of his teachers was Alan Hauser, the great Apache sculptor that has a gallery dedicated to him at the Smithsonian today. At that time, he was teaching at the Institute and was so impressed with Duane, asked him to be his assistant. And Duane said, "No, I'm going to go back to Minnesota." I could have kicked him at that moment, but he's a good artist, primarily self-taught. Alan Hauser was a great influence on him, but he has a great loyalty to northern Minnesota too. And I guess if I could say, probably the most important thing about him was his loyalty to home. There are many Indian artists that moved to Santa Fe, took one look around and said, "I am never going back home again." Because in Santa Fe, there's a lot of institutional support. There's a lot of Indian artists. There's a big community full of Indian artists there. And so why should they come back to White Earth when there was not a single artist working in that area at that time when Duane came back? Duane virtually created the arts community himself.
I really admire Dewey. We've been here at the college a long time. He's always has had so much energy, and even with his physical impairment, he just does miraculous things.
He's a dynamo.
Oh my gosh, yeah, I admire him. I mean, you know, he's just always on the ball, always creating.
I've overcome some severe setbacks like losing my eye to a carpentry accident, busted up my right arm in a wild rice finishing process, but I've managed to prevail and achieve what I've achieved.
Like I said, I never thought of my father going to boarding school. But then looking back on it, on his behavior, how we were raised, there's boarding school written all over it. For one thing, he refused to teach us the Ojibwe language because he was taught that he shouldn't do that. He remained fluent all of his life, and it was a thrill to me to listen to him speaking Ojibwe to other older Indians, but he never taught us. He insisted that we only speak English, even though in our house we heard the Ojibwe language spoken, we heard the Finnish language spoken. In the town that I grew up in, I could hear Slovenian and Swedish and Italian on the street. It would have been a perfect place for me to be multilingual. Thinking back on it now, I would have loved that. It's hard to look back on it and look at those decisions that were made in the 1920s and try to gainsay them. I mean, you can't.
The government had a trust responsibility to take care of us because they thought we were not quite human. So we had gone into a period of deeper and deeper poverty. And so they're always trying to think of ways, how can they take care of the American Indian? And so when they went into the assimilation era, it was that idea, well, we'll make them into US citizens. And we'll do that through the boarding schools, and then we'll also teach them how to be farmers, and we'll give them their own land so that they can learn to farm it and they'll feed themselves. So the thing about the children is that when they went to the boarding schools, they were modeled after the US schools. They start in kindergarten, and they go up through 12th grade. And so the different boarding schools, they serve different ages. And the boarding school at Morris, it served kindergarten through 8th grade. And then other schools like Flandreau or Haskell, they would serve other ages. And so those children, they would go to one boarding school. And then once they would graduate from like Morris, then they would go on to another school like Flandreau or Pipestone. And so they would get moved around like that. What they wanted to do is, because we're not ethnic minorities, we're peoples of nations. And so a nation has its own language and culture. So it's very important for them to take away our language and our culture. And the way they'll do that is through the boarding schools. Captain Pratt, he said the way to change a nation is through the children. So that's why they would have young children. And you know, during those times too, like on Leech Lake, people were hungry. And we had been concentrated on these real small reservations. And so we weren't able to feed our children the way we had. Sometimes during these years, the rice crops would be bad, and that was a food we could depend on. And we weren't able to feed our children. So sometimes we would send the kids to the schools just so they could eat.
What I've found is that they were especially set up for cultural genocide. I mean, that was their whole design. You know, there are still people who defend boarding schools. Some of them are Indians.
Some of the horrors of the boarding school era, one is just, you come from a place, we come from the land, we come from this earth, and we're people of the water, and our families loved us. And so then they take you away from your family, and they tell you that you can't speak your language. And so how can you ask for information? How can you ask for food? How can you defend yourself when you can't speak your language? And so the horrors being that they took your voice away. Your ability to speak was taken away, and then you had to learn this other language. And sometimes the horror stories are where they would punish you. And they would do many different things, like make you kneel on rice for hours. They would hit them. They would put them in the cold rooms where they would put the food in to keep it frozen and keep it from decaying or thawing. And they would put the children in rooms like that and keep them in there. They would take their clothes away from them, and they would delouse them. They would cut their hair, and the hair was so important to them. And the children aren't understanding any of this that's going on because they're speaking to them in English. They would use turpentine on their hair to kill what bugs they thought might be there. And then they would have them dress in clothes that were not of their culture.
And boarding schools were like a big prison. So you look at the way the social life in prisons operate. You have gangs, and you have bullies, and you have victims, and you have people who just go along to get along in a prison situation. And the boarding schools were the same. Dressing in uniforms, living in great big dormitories, marching in the afternoon, horrific discipline.
They were very regimental in the way that they would treat them. They would get them up early in the morning, and they would march to their schoolrooms. They were not hugged, and when they were hugged or when they were touched, then many times it was in a horrible way, in a sexual way. So the children have no one to turn to, you know, no one to go to for help. The other way they might get touched is like the being hit, being punished like that.
I was reading Jim Northrup's commentary on Pipestone, and he said that the very first day that he sat down to eat with 75 other boys in this big hallway, the very first meal that they had, the big boys came and took all his food. And he said that he learned to have to protect his food when he was 6. Now, the guy who took his food was the bully that thought the boarding school was a real great place, because he got to eat all he wanted. He took it away from the little kids. So these were the people who thought boarding schools were a real great thing.
When people are disrespected, they will start turning in on themselves, and so those children would start to hurt themselves or each other. And so bullying would happen in the schools. In the school that my father went to, the older boys would take all the food from the little boys, and the little boys were literally starving. And so what they did was they had the little boys sit with the older female students so that they would get to eat. So there was that bullying that was happening in the schools too.
So as I started researching about boarding schools, I realized that there was actually very little material out there, and most of it was very pro boarding schools. A lot of the material thought boarding schools were a real good idea. And as I started researching it, now I have to tell you, this was 1972, and this was before generational trauma theory was out there, and that wasn't until, I believe it was Marilyn Braveheart that first introduced it to us based on research from Holocaust victims and the survivors of Japanese American internment camps. And that trauma is passed on through the generations. If it stops in one generation, it doesn't mean that the trauma ends, that it's passed on. And it's passed on through behavior, through subtle cues, through values. And no one actually realized that Indian kids traumatized in boarding school would pass on that trauma to their own children, even if they didn't send their children to boarding school.
So then when the artist Dewey makes that sculpture, and that woman, see, she's made of stone, and it doesn't wear away. Her love is like that for all her children. And just like stone, she'll always be there for her children. So that's just really powerful, that Mindamuye down there at U of M Morris is made out of that stone. And then that whole image of those two children holding on to her like that, and her holding on to them, is just awesome.
Well, I envision first and foremost the strength of a lot of Native families, which is the grandmother, the mother, the great-grandmother. They've always stood strong. When the men were at a low time, the women still stood strong and kept the family unit together. So I chose the grandmother because my mother was there for a lot of grandkids and other children, taking them in, feeding them. So I chose the grandmother.
The grandparents, they were always there, and they were the ones who were still fluent in the language, and they were still practicing cultural ways. So there were a lot of deaths of our people during the assimilation era. It was like something like 60% of our Ojibwe people died during that particular era. And it had to do with disease, mainly. And so a lot of times the children wouldn't have a parent, and so the grandparents would take care of them, and a lot of times to be the grandmother. And so that just reminds me of Duane Goodwin's statue, how it's the grandmother who's taking care of the two children. And in the statue, how it has that little boy, he's got the uniform on. They would send leftover military uniforms for the children to wear. And so the little boy, he's got on his uniform holding on to the grandmother, and the other little girl, she's got on her traditional dress holding on to her grandmother. But they're holding on to the old ways in that way. They're holding on to those ones who gave us life and held us together during all those hard times. Yeah.
The dedication was going to be to them something very important.
You'll be seated in the front row,
okay.
And I asked Bambi to sit there and stuff
okay.
too. Any family that can fit.
Okay.
We need 2 chairs for the Hepners, a chair for the chancellor.
They wanted to show the people how proud they were of this project. They came to me earlier to ask how it should be done, what kind of food we should serve, to a large audience. So they asked me to give them some ideas on what to make for this menu, for this dedication. I thought that was important to ask. What kind of food do you like to see at your dedication? I said, yeah, I like to see buffalo. You know, and, oh yeah, they can get it. I said it might be a little expensive, but they'll get it. And sure enough, they got it. They had a nice meal of Indian food, and they had a very large audience of the community, of alumni. This project at the University of Morris, Minnesota, was made possible by Mary and Punky Hefner, alumni that felt they needed to address the original history of where the University of Morris came from. I believe it's a respect for our history. You know, they want to have something representational that's a good, strong example that this is still a strong memory and part of their university, the Native American aspect of the land and the people that once lived there before they were there.
Thanks for watching. Join us again on Common Ground. If you have an idea for Common Ground in north central Minnesota, email us at legacy@lptv.org or call 218-333-3014. To watch Common Ground online, visit lptv.org and click local shows. Episodes or segments of Common Ground, call 218-333-3020. Production funding of Common Ground was made possible in part by First National Bank Bemidji, continuing their second century of service to the community. Member FDIC. Common Ground is brought to you by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, with money by the vote of the people November 4th, 2008. If you watch Common Ground online, consider becoming a member or making a donation at lptv.org.